Hello, Dr. Rose.
How are you? Yeah, please call me Todd.
Hello, Todd. I'm good. I'm good. How's the weather where are you at right now?
Boston. So
Boston.
yeah, it's not bad. It's about 80 degrees. How about you?
It's a bit windy in here, out there. So it's a bit windy at your place as well. It's really
Yeah, it's been.
a bit chilly. I think it's 10 degrees outside. So it's not really the summer weather I was longing for. So
Yeah, it's we're finally now that with the vaccines and stuff, we're finally getting. I'm taking to take my first like
you are.
vacation. We're gonna go to Vegas. Vegas.
You are. You're going to get your first vaccination, your first shot.
So we just finished. We've got my family's fully vaccinated now, so we're going to Las Vegas to try to get out of this lockdown a bit.
All right. So how are things going in your surroundings in the Boston area concerning COVID?
It's actually, look, I mean, knock on wood, right? But it's one of those things of like, it's amazing what a competent administration can do, right?
Yeah,
Like,
yeah.
because it's now we just got to worry about like over here in Boston, we don't really have the problem of like the anti-vaxxer kind of group in the same
Mhm,
way. You know what I mean? It's
mhm.
just it's a more educated group, so it's been pretty smooth. Um, but we'll see. But yeah, so far so good. How about over there?
Well, we are a bit of a slow starter, but we're slowly getting there. The European Commission is really trying, is doing really making some efforts to get a COVID-19 passport or document in order for
Yeah,
people to be allowed to travel during summer, because many countries are dependent on tourism. So it's really important that most Europeans are vaccinated before summer. So
yeah,
they're doing their best, but it's really a really difficult logistic effort. And some vaccine companies or like Pfizer find it difficult to deliver all the millions of vaccines. So it's a struggle for many countries. Yeah.
yeah. That's why the Johnson and Johnson one I think is the best hope. I mean, it's a single shot. You don't have to have it in freezing cold.
Yeah.
But
So I'm really curious before we move to the book I wrote you about. Before we go there, COVID-19 and education. What does education look like at the moment at Harvard?
so just for you, so I actually took that opportunity through COVID to. I've actually left Harvard now.
Oh,
So
really?
like I just it was fine. I mean, it looks like every other place. You're just basically a bunch of people learning on Zoom, like
Yeah.
you know. But I'm just way more. I'm really fascinated about the moment we're living in globally and what it means for the future of education. And I just don't believe that the real change is going to come from higher ed in general, let alone the Ivy League. And they have too much vested interest in the status quo for them to be truly transformative. And so I have a think tank called Populous that I had started when I was at Harvard, and had made an agreement. So rather than being on tenure track, I was going to leave and start that. And they were really good to me, and it's been really good to be on my own, to be able to do just what I want to do.
So what you're saying is they're too much attached to the status quo at Harvard. Change is not going to come from Harvard. What change are you talking about?
Look, for education, I don't think. Look, we live in a society now globally where in the industrial age, the innovation was that stuff could move really fast, right? But now information moves faster than stuff, and so it used to be that if you went like to these places, and you could basically have a scarcity model of higher ed. Everybody gets some basic education, and then you can compete for a good spot. And then if you get that credential, you'd slot into a pretty stable job, that allowed you to, have some opportunities. And that just doesn't, it's just not really true anymore. And so I think that the future has to be far more flexible. You cannot have a model. This is where I just decided I would be a hypocrite to stay. Wonderful people,
Mhm.
wonderful, love my time there, but higher education in the United States is based on false scarcity, right? Like quality equals how few people can you educate. So Harvard, with 40 something $billion endowment, hasn't added a single seat to their undergrad education in 60 years. So it's just like, that's nonsensical, right? There is no sense of scarcity when it comes to creating opportunity structures for people to acquire skills and knowledge they need to realize their potential, make a contribution. So I think that the future is far more about multiple pathways, broader set of credentialing institutions, and really competing to like genuinely develop people's potential, not just provide this sort of like, well, you got in and because you went to this great school, like, I don't know. I
Yeah.
feel like, and I think that the good news is with our technology and our know-how, like it is actually possible to give everybody a great education. It really is.
Yeah. Do you know, let me see, just 1 second. This one, it's called Head, Hand, Heart. It's written by
No.
an English journalist named David Goodhart. And he founded a think tank called Demos. And this is about that the knowledge economy that doesn't need that much knowledge workers anymore. So many people
Mhm.
go to Ivy League universities. Oh, we don't have Ivy League in England. It's different. But anyway, to Oxford and
Mhm.
these kinds of institutes, and just a few of them really get these high-paid jobs, and most of them do really vocational jobs, regular jobs that
Yeah,
anyone, even without an education, could do. So
it's
somehow,
it's
some
so true.
yeah, and he it's a really brilliant analysis, and still we are attracting many students from abroad here in Holland and in America as well, from China, from India. So there's still this notion that universal education means better job opportunities. But somehow,
And it doesn't, yeah.
so
We're
you,
overeducating this elite class, and that you're right, they're doing jobs that you didn't really even need
yeah,
that for. It's like, and it's just a race to the bottom, right? And in the US, for example, I mean, student loan debt is greater than credit card debt. Like,
yeah,
it so it just
it's more than trillion dollars.
just a lose. Yep. And I think that the panic has brought relief challenges, and that the public is, yeah.
It was an unstable connection. Just
Go ahead.
for a sec, I just missed your last sentence because of the connection. So what was your last sentence about?
I just that the pandemic has helped, at least here, as which is all I really know right now. The public is frustrated. They understand they want something different, and now it's about helping to galvanize that shift
Yeah.
in aspirations and make that real for people.
Yeah, and by making that real for people, there's a part for you. There's a role for you, for Todd Rose, because you're on the
Yes.
side of the people. You're a
Yes.
people's person, and so you are going to try to make that happen. And
Yes.
so Harvard and Oxford and Cambridge, they will try to maintain their system. How are they going to do that, do you think?
So first of all, they don't have to, like, they never have to be the first mover on anything, right? Because they can sit back and wait, and then if something really does change, they have enough money and clout to try to just get ahead of it, right? It's kind of like, I think of them, if you think about it in technology, they're a bit like Apple, right? So you talk to my buddy who was,
Yeah.
you like, look, if you're Apple, you should never be the first or company to innovate on something because there's almost no upside, right? See if anybody cares about it, and if they do, then race in there and do it better than anyone else.
Yeah.
And I think that the first thing I'd say is you don't look to Oxford or Harvard to lead in transformation, right? Because there's no upside for them. The system right now is fantastic for them. And they know how to play it better than anybody else. So my thing is that the biggest risk is simply that we look to them for innovation, but in fact, their own interests are not in that space. Their own interests are in preserving status quo. And they'll say all the right things, right? They'll say they care about this. And a lot of the individuals there really do care about it. But as an institution, there's no way. There's no way. And so what you'll get is systematic undermining of efforts to transform the system because it puts at risk their very existence as who they are.
Yeah.
And so to me, it's like decoupling this sense that somehow going to Oxford or Harvard is the pinnacle of educational achievement. It's fantastic. I'm glad I went to Harvard, but I also went to an open enrollment public university for my undergrad at Weber State University that literally anybody can go to,
Mhm.
and it was a fantastic education too.
I think in the end, but maybe we will talk about it at the end of the interview, the future of education. Universities like MIT and Harvard will contribute to their own demise in the end because they're offering MOOCs and certificates. And someday, uh, uh, today's students are competing with the Chinese and with Indians in India and with people from
Yeah.
Thailand. We just don't realize it yet. But on the day, blockchain, for instance, is a lot more reliable. And companies trust blockchain technology, for example, and MOOC
Yeah.
does the job for companies.
Yeah.
Man,
Well, you're exactly right, by the way. So like my view is that like edX, right, which Harvard jumped in and it funds a lot. If you're basically saying like, hey, listen, there's something magical about what we do and it's worth $60,000 a year and it's better than everyone else and you can't replicate it, but then you go and do some pretty high quality MOOC stuff,
mm-hmm.
like, and they're like, well, we're not going to give a degree off of it. Yeah, that's just a matter of time now though.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
like you cannot, like, if somebody's taking these classes and they're getting certified and it turns out they actually know what they're doing,
Yeah.
at some point employers are going to say, wait, what do we care if you actually physically were like sat in a seat at Harvard in Cambridge, Massachusetts?
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
unless it's like a consulting firm like McKinsey that runs on reputation, most employers just want people with skills and knowledge,
I
to
mean,
do the job. So
you need somebody who knows to develop a Java game or something, or JavaScript or
right.
Python. And if you can do a MOOC on Harvard and you master Python, and that's all the company needs, you don't have to do an IT bachelor or a computer technology
Yeah.
bachelor or master's. It's totally useless.
And that's going to be the disaggregated credentialing is like the biggest no-brainer for higher ed. Like the package for your diploma is a silly idea that is just, we are doing it because it's what we've always done.
Yeah.
But it doesn't really make any sense at all.
The reason I wrote to you, well, actually, it was this book, John Couch. I read this book first, and page 27 starts with your name, actually.
Oh,
Chapter 3, yes, chapter 3. Let's see, is it chapter 4? And it was your fascinating story is written down in chapter 3. It starts here. Todd was a classic underachiever with a long history of behavioral and motivational problems that reportedly had caused him to struggle throughout grade school. That's the first sentence. And the next couple of pages are about your life. So I was really triggered by that and really inspired. So after that, I wrote, I read your book. So it was John Couch who pointed the way. I live in the Netherlands, and in the Netherlands we have the habit of streaming kids into certain tracks at the age of 12. So
Yeah.
when you're 12, every kid in the Netherlands is doing an IQ test. Really, we don't call it an IQ test, but
Right.
it's similar. And when you have, let's say, 80 points on this standardized test, you are going to a vocational track. When you have 100 points, you go to a applied science track. And when you have 110, you go to a science track. And it's really hard to escape from that track. Going to a track means that every subject you take is on the same level. So let's say you're really good at Dutch, but really an underachiever when it comes to uh, math. You go to the lowest level, and all your subjects are offered to you at the lowest level, even though your math, your Dutch skills are really high. So when the student goes to school and he brings back his books, all the different subjects are on the same level. So all the
It,
books are.
it's
I mean,
classic average based thinking, right?
yeah,
Like, yeah,
averagarian thinking. That's what we do here.
yeah,
So that's why I think we should talk, just to see if we can wake up some people at policy level.
sounds great.
So um, it was really fun to read that some Dutch guy had a role to play as well, Peter Molenman. So let's.
He's the hero, right? So
He's the hero. Yeah, he's a big
yeah.
hero. It's a shame we lost him to the United States,
Well,
but
and how funny was it how you lost him, right? There's like, the system's the system. It
it's the
doesn't matter
system.
that,
It
yeah,
has,
he's like, I've got this idea, I think it's important. And they're like, well,
it's
it's the system.
insane. It's exactly what you try to illustrate, that this system kills innovation. So let's start from the beginning. This is about the end of average. So what I'm let's start from the beginning. Where did it come from? The average thinking.
It, so it's funny because that's why I got so interested in why I wrote the book, because I was thinking, we just take for granted that there's an average person, that this average is real. And I was like, where did that come from, right? And it turns out that it was a Belgian astronomer, Adolf Quetelet, who was actually just, he's living in the 1800s. He's living at a time when we first have access to what would have been considered big data then, which was just census data. Some of the first census were collected, and he was an astronomer. And in astronomy, the big challenge that they had always faced was, like, okay, so people are measuring, say, stars or whatever. Like, there's going to be measurement error, right? You're not going to get a perfect measurement all the time. And they were like, who do you trust? Like, whose measurement do you trust? And what they figured out was, as long as it was just random error, what you would do is average together all the observations, and that average was usually closer to the truth. And that turns out to be true. But but Quetelet makes this leap that would forever change society, which is, he's like looking at this bell curve in astronomical data, and then he sees some of the first census data, and he sees a bell curve, and he's like, well, wait a minute, maybe this same idea could apply to human beings. And what's so interesting about Quetelet is he wasn't a bad guy, unlike Galton, which I'm sure we'll talk about, who was a bad
We
guy.
will.
He's a really bad guy.
Well, his
But
ideas, yeah.
yeah, he was eugenics, right? But Quetelet really did care about society, and really did care about peaceful, prosperous folks. But what he came to believe, because he saw a bell curve, it was literally data on Scottish soldiers'
Yeah,
body size.
yeah.
He decided that the average, not only was it useful, but it was like true, like a Platonic ideal, that basically the average person in any society was the ideal. And in his mind, if you were on the upper end of the curve or the lower end of the curve, it didn't matter. Any deviation from the average was what literally he called a monstrosity, right? So he's the first to really cement it. And what's funny is when he comes out with this idea of the average man, he gets just ridiculed. Like, the people at the time were like, this is the stupidest thing I've ever heard, right? Because it like it is kind of silly. But
What time
why
period
it's
are we talking about? Just for
1830s.
Mhm.
And he why it sticks around. So like he's just getting ridiculed, except for um, it gives rise to insurance companies. So, because if you think about it, insurance is just amortizing risk. You don't need to know anything about any one person. You just need a pool of people, right? And you can, and so it turns out that using those averages was really good for risk and insurance. Well, that's going to have an effect on people's lives. They started becoming the way we think. But here's a funny thing that most people don't know. So right now, like with COVID, we in the States we use like BMI, right, body mass index,
yes,
as one of the indicators for who gets a vaccine first, right? Um, Body mass index is a garbage metric for individuals. Like it is so bad. Like
yeah,
nobody. It's really good for populations, but it is a terrible predictor of individual health, right? Because it combines a bunch of things like fat and
yeah,
bone
yeah,
and
yeah.
muscle.
We will come
So
to the jaggedness principle later on. You mentioned body mass index in your book as well, I believe.
Quetelet invented it.
Yeah,
So the guy that invented the average man invented body mass index,
yeah,
right? So that's the start of it. And then some other folks that we can talk about take it and run with it in some pretty dark places.
yeah. Yeah, so Kedele considered the average man as the ideal. Huh? You mentioned Norma, the average woman in the United States, and how in a contest it was impossible to find actually the average woman because it's just an average. And how can you ever? I mean, it was. I think you didn't. She wasn't found on all different points.
There,
So for Kedele, his ideal was the average man, but then we we come to what's his name,
Galton.
Galton, and he had a different approach.
Galton. So this is where it really goes sideways. So, so whereas Quetelet saw that bell curve and he said the average is amazing, and this is what we should all strive for. Galton was an aristocrat in England, living in a time when merchants were rising and poor people were demanding not only better living conditions, but they wanted to participate, right, in politics and things like that. So obviously to Galton, that was terrible, right? Like,
Mhm. Yeah,
um, and so he was trying to figure out how do we preserve English society and the elites because he thought those were the best, right?
yeah.
And people who were poor for a reason, and the
Mhm.
last thing you'd want is for them to keep procreating and overrun society. And so Galton was actually first cousins with Charles Darwin,
Yeah,
and Darwin publishes Origin of Species, Survival of the Fittest, and
evolution.
Galton's exactly. So Galton's one of the first to basically create social Darwinism,
Yeah,
right? Where and he was like, well, wait a minute. Rather than let natural selection work, we could do artificial selection. But to do that, you would have to have some way to measure who was better than other people. And so he reads Quetelet and he says, "Wow, what a smart man! He just made one mistake. This 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 deviation from average is not error; it is actually the important signal." And so he's like, "What I don't," he's like, "Who wants to be average? What we want to do is find the people who are above average and incentivize society to allow them to breed." But his problem is, well, how do I measure how far people are from average? So Galton invents things that we still use today, like percentiles. He invented percentiles, but it was purely as a way to measure how far from average you
yeah,
were, right? And then he invented things like he invented correlation so that we could start to like link different attributes. And it's all in the name of selection, right? It's all in the name of finding people who were better. And so he leads this idea of eugenics, right? Which is like he proposes a society where if you were high on these scores that he created, right? Like women, for example, he was like, if they were like the best as I determined, we should pay them to do nothing but have babies.
Mhm.
And if you're poor or you didn't score very well on an IQ test or what they were the kind of test they were using, they wanted to like be able to sterilize you, right? And that idea caught on. So between these two men, right, you have Kedley who's saying average is amazing and we should like strive for that average, and
Yes.
Galton saying no, 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 average is terrible. We only want better than average.
Yeah.
What we're all accepting now is that average is an okay reference, right? Um, and that gets imported. So even today, right, if we start talking about things like who we are as people, we almost always use either a type or a rank, right? So a type is just Kedley, right? You're just taking a segment of a group and finding the average and being like, yes, I'm a type A person or
Mhm.
whatever, right? Like I'm bringing, or it's how far you deviate from the average that defines you, and that's the world we live in now.
Yeah. And that view um, permeates into education at some point. It enters education, and we needed Mr. Thorndike to do that. So when did he come into the picture? And who is he, by the
So
way?
yeah, and now we'll move stateside here, which that's it's a little closer to the stuff that I know. But so we'll go from Belgium and
Yeah.
England, the states. So it's funny. These ideas around average are going to get where they become very valuable is in the standardization movement,
Mhm.
right? In general, because standardization just means literally finding the best way to do something and doing it just that way, right? Like no deviation. Um, and there's actually two people that really matter, and Thorndike's one of them for education. But preceding that was Frederick Taylor,
Yeah.
who invented a thing called scientific management, which, by the way, has dominated the world. Like it is like most people, most businesses,
Still.
most employers, still to this day, even if they don't even know his name,
Yeah.
are actually running their businesses based on scientific management. And it was absurd. Frederick Taylor literally believed for everything you need to do, there was one right way to do it.
Yeah.
And he decides that you're just going to strip workers of all autonomy. He invented the idea of a manager, and he said there'll be people who decide what you do, and then there's workers who just execute it, right? And now the upside to that, I think it's terrible, but the upside is you're going to be a lot more efficient in the short term, right? And so he was able to like organize factories and make sense of that. And like it probably did benefit in terms of material prosperity, but at an enormous cost, right? Because it strips the dignity and individuality out of basically everybody.
Yeah.
Well, if this is how work starts to operate, it wasn't terribly surprising that it didn't take long for education to have to snap into line two. And so you see the rise, like in the United States, it was right around like what we would call the high school movement, where in the early 1920s, you're trying to think, oh shoot, for this industrial society, people have to have more skills and more knowledge. How
Yeah.
do we mass educate people? So Edward Thorndike, who's considered the father of educational psychology, he literally invented standardized tests. He literally wrote some of the seminal textbooks on things. He is the guy who's just like, but he's a disciple of Galton, right? He believes in eugenics. He believes that there are smart people and there are dumb people.
Yeah.
And so what was funny is he literally rejected the idea that everyone should be able to go to high school because he didn't think they had the brains to do it. But so he's building these things. So we're still living in education. I don't care where you are in the world, you are affected by Thorndike, Edward
Yeah.
Thorndike, at some level. So even like we were just talking earlier, like the idea of using a bell curve test, right? That's Thorndike, right? So you think about even like there are things that we can talk about, like mastery based assessments, where it's just purely about what you actually know.
Mhm.
But most of the assessments that we use around the globe to make really, really critical decisions, like I would almost bet you anything that these tests at age 12 in the Netherlands are norm referenced assessments,
Yes,
right?
they
Like,
are. Yes.
so okay, so here's the dirty secret. If you don't know, that test is not in any way, shape, or form measuring what any one kid actually knows. It is entirely designed to differentiate a kid from another kid, right? That's all it is.
Yeah.
That's all it is. And so here's what's silly about that. It means that no matter how terrible, like, you could have everyone in the Netherlands at age 12 do awful at it, but there will always be a top 10%, right? There will always be. But similarly, you could have uh, teachers and an education system that did such an amazing job that every kid in the Netherlands is actually excelling, but on that test, half the kids have to fail. They
Yeah.
have to.
Yeah.
So it's like, what are we doing? And if you think about how absurd that really is, right? If you look at something like medicine, and when we credential, say, a surgeon, everywhere it matters, we never use these bell curve tests. Because think about how stupid this would be. So, someone, you got a bunch of people who are ready to be surgeons, and there's a test. Do you want a test that says, I don't care how bad you are, 10% of you are going to get to be surgeons no matter what?
Yeah.
No,
Yeah,
no.
that's insane.
Like,
Yeah.
and so it's like, if all of you pass, you all get to be surgeons. And if none of you pass, you don't get to be surgeons.
Yeah.
If it's good enough for medicine, it's good enough for our kids, right? It's unacceptable that but most people just don't realize that's what these tests do.
You know, I have my eldest son. I have three kids, and a 1 year old, a 3 year old, and a 12 year old. And my eldest son was a school dropout. He left two schools because he was disobedient in the eyes of the teachers, and they wanted to send him to a special ed school. And I thought, well, this is wrong. You don't know what's going on. You don't scrutinize. You just assess him by what you see. So we refused to send him to a special ed school. So we did an IQ test, and he has, according to the IQ test, a score of 135, which is a gifted child. So now he's attending a school for gifted children. But you know, in the end, what that means is that the teachers look at the kids differently. That's the only thing, you know.
That's it.
You know, last year I spoke to Professor Robert Rosenthal, and he did the Pygmalion effect. Maybe you know that.
Yeah, it's exactly what I was going to bring up right there. That's exactly right.
I will send you the interview. We talked for more than 2 hours. Amazing guy. And you know the experiment where some teachers were told, I think it was actually a Harvard test from Harvard. We did the Harvard intelligence test, and we assessed that these 5 kids have the ability to grow to exceptional levels, but they don't show it yet. But just to wait, these are highly intelligent kids, and they were just so the same as every
other. It was
other.
random. They randomly assigned scores.
They randomly
right?
assigned scores, but the next year they thrived. They excelled in all the different subjects. And Rosenthal investigated. He did the research, and he saw little cues like prolonged feedback and non-verbal communication, and more, you know, just a little thing.
Exactly. What else he saw, as I recall, is even a teacher who is being thoughtful. If I'm looking at you and I don't think you have what it takes, when you're struggling, I'll stop the feedback, because I don't want to, even if I don't want to embarrass you, right? But if I think you're gifted, when you don't understand, I'm thinking, oh wow, I must not have done a good job explaining it. I'm going to re-explain it, right? Like, and those small micro level things ladder up to literally substantially different experiences and substantially different outcomes. And this reminds me, I'll tell you one other thing in this space is, so with gifted programs, one of my favorite educators, Benjamin Bloom, right? Like he was pretty famous for inventing mastery learning. He and his grad student were studying this idea of gifted programs, and Bloom had this great quote about the way they had developed tests to decide who gets to be in the gifted program. He said, that's how ungifted people would figure out how to deal with gifted programs. You know, like, and what they found, and I thought this was really cool, that in terms of the single best predictor of, like, how do you select people to be in these advanced classes, and they studied whether you use tests, whatever else, prior grades. It turns out the best predictor of getting a composition of kids who will thrive there, was simply to literally open it to everyone, tell them exactly what the work would be, and let kids choose for themselves. Because listen, if you're terrible at it, the last thing you want to do is be in a class where you have to do more work and
Yeah.
higher
Yeah.
work. And so it turns out like we're just like, it's so funny how we do this rather than using our technologies and using our know-how to allow creating a really great fit for every kid, right? Because some kids are going to be great at aspects of math and they're not going to be so good at something else. So leveling across
Even
the board,
gifted kids. I mean, my son is not really
guaranteed.
into languages, and he's great at programming. He's programming Java right now, and JavaScript, and he's really doing well. And also science, but he's not really a language guy. English is good
And
though, but
it is
because
true about every human being. That's the trick.
yeah,
Is
yeah,
just
we will
it
get
is
to the jaggedness principle soon. But what I wanted to say is this school works for him because I think it's exactly the Rosenthal experiment because his teachers are told his IQ is 135, so they are figuring, man, these kids are smart. There must be something that triggers them, and they keep looking for that one thing that triggers these kids. They are given many opportunities, and I think that's the trick. It's not um, I don't think they have any really special traits. I mean, what's an IQ test? It's just
nope.
they are given so many more opportunities, and I know
It's
you're
exactly right.
yeah. So
Exactly right.
um, you describe three pathways, and we are already talking about pathways in some form. The jaggedness pathway, the context pathway, and just remind me there, the last one.
Pathways, multiple pathways. So
Yeah.
jaggedest context pathways.
Oh,
Yep.
okay. Yeah. So let's discuss the three different pathways.
Yeah. So okay. So when you come to think about a person, if we can't use averages or rank order, like how do we think about ourselves? And so from the science that I'm a part of, the science of the individual, um, that has swept through medicine and genetics and nutrition and everything, where we study individuals instead of groups of people, we rely on three basic principles to think about it. So jaggedness principle, context principle, pathways. So jaggedness principle, start with that, is like simply stated, is that any characteristic, human characteristic that you care about is always multi-dimensional, right? And those dimensions are not correlated like you think they are, which means you can never reduce someone to a single score ever. And let me give you just a concrete one from the book, just to kind of ground it for people. So if you take body size, right? So when I say it's multi-dimensional, like if I say height, well, height is one dimensional, right? But when I say size, it's multiple things,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Like height, weight, chest width, whatever, right? You could go on for hundreds of different dimensions to describe a body size, right? So if we're talking about height, it's one dimensional. Then there is an average, and that average actually is meaningful, right? One dimension.
Yeah.
With size, so if you think about it right now, the tallest person that you know
Yeah.
is probably not the heaviest person you know. There are tall, skinny people. There are short, heavy people, right?
Yeah.
So in the study of body size, every single time we've ever studied the population on multiple dimensions of size, it turns out there is literally never an average body size, ever, ever. The most recent one, the Canadian Retailers Association did a massive study of tens of thousands of people on body size, looking at how you calibrate clothing size. Same thing. Everybody has what we call a jagged profile
Yeah.
in body size.
Yeah.
You will be on the high end of some things, in the middle on others, and the low end. Literally every single person. And this is why we have to have dressing rooms, right, to try stuff on, because there's no such thing as a medium. It doesn't work that way,
Yeah.
right? There's no
Yeah.
such thing as a large. Those are useful conveniences, right? There you go, right? Like those two people in that image have on average, have the same body size.
The same size,
Yeah,
general size. Yes.
general size. That like their scores average out to the exact same size. It does, so it's absurd, right? And like now, what's important there is we've learned that about body size, and we've done things like create, instead of we do things like ergonomics and human factors to learn how to design more flexible environments. But this same insight about human jaggedness holds for mental abilities too. It even holds for character. Like, it's just, you have to start by assuming any human being, including yourself, on anything you care about is going to have this jaggedness. And so once you recognize that, there's pretty straightforward implications, right? As I said earlier, it means you cannot, under any circumstances, reduce someone to a single score. But of course, that's all we do, right?
Yeah.
Like on that test at age 12, that's exactly what we do. But
Take
it's
take
garbage then.
take any subject in school. If somebody says I suck at math, I mean that's so broad. If you say I
Right.
suck at English, what do you mean? Reading, listening, writing?
Yep.
I mean,
And
so
and when we look at people's math performance in subsets, it's exactly what you said. Like the kid that is good at algebra is not necessarily good at geometry. Those sorts of math rely on very, very different underlying. So
Mhm.
like geometry is very visual, right? You can actually, is like algebra is, you have to memorize algorithms, you have to remember, like they're different skills.
Yeah,
And yet we said, oh, I'm not good at math. Like that's
yeah,
not a thing,
yeah,
right? And so the second implication, besides you can't use single score selection criteria, is in the way we design our learning environments. So we continue, education around the world is still the last industry that incentivizes average based design. We call it like age appropriate or developmentally appropriate, but all it means is exactly what you were saying before. When you get tracked into these streams, we assume, okay, like before you're even tracked, would say, okay, you're in fourth grade. Well, we're going to design curricular material for what the average fourth grader, how well they can read, what they care about, whatever, right? And when we stream you, we'll put you in classes that are all leveled, assuming that like all people in that track have more or less the same
yeah,
capabilities.
yeah.
It's ridiculous, right? So what's interesting in the States, there's been a big push, and it's even in federal law now, called Universal Design for Learning, which is, it actually shows you, here's all the ways that kids naturally differ cognitively, affectively, motivationally, and here's the range. And you should design a curricular environment that is adaptive to that full range, right? Instead of expecting teachers and students to do the heavy lift of working with a very mediocre learning environment. So once you understand jaggedness, you understand these norm referenced single score tests, like we should never use them. I know that sounds like harsh. They are beyond useless because they give the impression of knowledge when
Yeah,
they are not that at all. They were never meant to be that.
yeah.
They were meant for people like Francis Galton and to be able to control society, to
Mhm.
organize people in the way they want them organized. They have nothing to do with your kid and their potential, and they have everything to do with controlling other people.
It would be, I'm a teacher of English, and you would be surprised how many kids flunk their test but still speak American to a great extent because American pop culture is really dominant here in the Netherlands. They watch American movies, they listen to American music, they chat online with American people, they game online with American people. So they know in general how to speak American, but all we assess them with is grammar and
Yeah.
vocab they never use. I mean, so many kids are under the assumption that they don't master English at all. So they flunk their test, but they can speak English. It's enough to survive in Dutch society. But somehow, when they go through our system, they are under the assumption they suck at English. But in fact, they speak pretty decently, I must say.
Yeah, and it's funny because it's, again, it's like we have this system that was based on these false assumptions. The truth is back in the day, I'm not sure what else we would have done, right? If you're going to provide public education for everyone, maybe you did just have to standardize it. But we don't live in that world. It is absurdly easy to create flexible learning
It
environments,
is.
right? It is not more expensive. It is just different, right? And so our willingness to continue to have an education system that colossally wastes people's potential that does harm to kids. The thing that bothers me about education more than anything, okay, in medicine, we care about side effects, right? So if someone said, I have a pill that will lower cholesterol, well, that's not good enough. What's the side effect profile? What are the downsides? Because on the whole, it may be worse for you, even if it solves this. In education, we'll do research and go, oh, well, look, this thing it increases test scores by 10%, do it. But we never ask about the side effects. We never ask about what it does to the kids' motivation, to their curiosity, to their self view, right? And I think we do incredible harm to kids. And I don't think by not talking about that, we make it seem like it's just neutral, but it's not, because there are kids that I believe would have been better off not to be in school, given what happens to them as a result of running buzzsaw into these standardized systems.
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to find out. I think I'm thinking of writing a book on how to get educated without school. And I think this age and era provides us with tools to get an education without going to school. The only difficulty is school is mandatory until the age of 18 in the Netherlands. There's no way the
Yeah.
government is allowing for us to not to go to school. I mean, we have to. If we don't go to school, we are penalized.
Well,
You get,
same here. We like in Massachusetts, like if we don't drop our kids off, if they have a certain number of unexcused absences, that is a reason to even initiate child protective services, and you could lose your child, right?
really.
And
Yeah,
so here's what I'd say. What I would say is, look, I believe everyone should go to school, but I believe that as a society, we have an obligation, if we're going to make education compulsory. Like think about if we flip this around and said, and we went and told everyone in the Netherlands, listen, you can have your car repaired, but we are going to tell you exactly who you have to go to, exactly when you'll get to go. I don't think people would stand for that. Something as
yeah,
basic as, listen, we can take my car to whoever I want to take them
yeah,
to, right? Like,
yeah,
but somehow with our little children and their potential and their personalities, we're okay with turning them over. Like, unless you're rich, we're going to tell you this school, this teacher, this time, and it doesn't matter. Like, and so if we're going to do that, we've got to take seriously the obligation to make it worth it for them, right? And one of my favorite educational philosophers, John Dewey, said the only justification for compulsory education is the cultivation of distinctiveness, to help children discover who they are and turn that into fulfillment and contribution. Anything short of that is unacceptable. You can't justify compulsory education.
yeah. And then in exactly the same time period, there was John D. Rockefeller, who instated a commission and wrote this incredible report, and they came to quite an opposite conclusion.
Yeah.
So that's where we are. That's where we
But
are.
that was it. There was a battle for the soul of education
Hmm.
in the States that pitted John Dewey, who saw education as part of democracy, and that it wasn't preparing kids for some other life, it was their life, right? And you had to honor that.
Yeah.
And it was about teaching kids to become participants in a democracy and become self-directed. And he was the most liberal so this wasn't some right-wing thing. This was like, and he had a beautiful vision for this. But on the other side were like the Rockefellers, Thorndike,
Yeah.
these kind of things. And this is all happening in the rise of like the second industrial revolution, and everything is turning into a more standardized society. And so the folks like Thorndike and Rockefellers, what they had to offer was a pretty straightforward standardized experience. Use these tests, select, right? You could make it easy to do.
Hmm.
And and so like Dewey's vision and the things we're talking about now, those were trickier, right? He didn't have the technology that we have now. He didn't have the know-how. He had the gut feeling that it was the right thing to do, right? So of course he was going to lose. And so we're left with the last 100 years
Yeah.
around the globe of an education system that literally believes there's an average person and that most kids don't have anything meaningful to offer. Seriously, like,
Last year, I interviewed Noam Chomsky. You surely know him, and he
yes,
he said it was just he went to a Deweyite school in the 30s when he was a kid, primary Deweyite school, and he said, I never realized I was gifted in any way. I was just like a normal kid. I skipped a class maybe, but it was just when I went to high school with all the standardized tests and percentile scores that I realized, all right, I'm a smart guy. But he said when I was in the Deweyite school, it was never an issue whether I was the smartest kid or whether I was
it
gifted or not.
it's not a concept. It literally doesn't, like, you take something like Montessori schools. There's like no place for the idea that there's gifted, or it's no, there's just individual kids, and they have jaggedness,
Yeah,
and they all have potential, and the job is to help bring that out
yeah,
and cultivate it,
yeah,
right? So look, we know how to do this. We've done this for a while. This isn't rocket science. We're just in a system that educators like yourself, like, for you to do that, you have to work around the system.
yeah,
Do you know what I mean? Like,
yeah,
it's and I think that there's a moment here, in part because of COVID, where you couldn't have the status quo even if you wanted it for a while. You know what I mean? Like we've all had to make adjustments. So let's not just return back to a status quo, which I don't know in the Netherlands, in the States. So we do a lot of, at Populous, my think tank, a lot of private opinion research. So get around what people will say out loud. What do they privately care about?
mhm,
And in education, it doesn't matter what demographic you're talking about. They don't want better. They want different.
yeah,
They want something different.
yeah,
And that's been true even in the depth of COVID. We even asked them, okay, look, you don't even know where you're going to send your kid. You don't know how they're going to learn. Once we get this under control, do you want us to go back to doing this better?
yeah,
Like, do more of the same, only do it better, like before COVID, or should we reimagine education? 2/3 of American parents said reimagine education,
yeah.
even when they didn't even know how their kids would get educated. So we've got an appetite for something transformative, and what we can't do is miss that opportunity right
No,
now.
because it's there right in the open right now. We talked about the jaggedness principle. We have two more principles. I really
Sure.
like the example of the problem child with the, and that's the behavioral aspect. That's the context principle. When we talk about an aggressive child, especially in schools, we define children as aggressive
Yeah.
as soon as we can.
Yeah.
But
So context principle is simply this: any behavior, any performance, any aptitude cannot be understood outside of the immediate environment that someone's behaving, right? And, like, of course that's true. Like, but think about it. Like, as psychologists, we always decontextualize everything, right? We give you a personality test that is like literally your personality. You are type A. Well, come on. That's not true. Sometimes you are, sometimes you're not. And so what one of my favorite scientists, Yushi Shota at the University of Washington, discovered was what he called these if-then signatures.
yeah,
Which is because the reason we gravitate toward personality tests and stuff is because we know there's something stable about us. It's not that we just, like, vacillate with, the wind. And so we think, okay, well, maybe I am a type A person, or maybe I am aggressive. So he had come up with this by he was studying kids who were in a summer camp for kids that were supposed to be aggressive, and the criteria was like the cutoff on one of these kind of tests, right? Like, and we treat them all the same. But what happened was is they started studying them in context,
yeah.
right? Exactly like this. And what they found was that two kids could have the exact same score in terms of aggression,
Mhm.
and one kid would be completely docile with a teacher and hyper aggressive on the playground
Yeah,
with peers,
yeah,
and the other kid would be docile with peers and hyper aggressive, sometimes with only like a male teacher.
yeah.
So it's like what you found was, if we instead of saying you're aggressive, if we mapped the context and created an if then signature,
Mhm.
right, we can now predict your behavior much better, because here's the dirty secret. All these personality tests, they actually don't correlate with real life behavior. Like, it is, they only explain 9% of
Yeah,
behavior at best.
amazing.
Like, what is that 9%? If I went to a mechanic, and
Oh,
the mechanic's like, listen, I know I can explain 9% of what goes on in your car. Like,
yeah,
what?
yeah. That's
Right? So So if I understand, if Johnny is in a classroom that he is struggling in and he has a male teacher, he is likely to behave this way, right? Then we're on to something. And listen, every parent that's ever had a little kid knows, right? Think about it. Like, especially when they're really young, you know, if you've kept them out and they haven't had their nap, they will behave a certain way.
Yeah.
And you don't punish them worse for it. You know, you're like, listen, she's just tired. She hasn't had a nap,
Yeah.
right? It's
Yeah.
like, this is how we are as human beings. Like, so just like you got to think of yourself in terms of a jagged profile, you got to start thinking of yourself in terms of if then signatures.
Yeah.
When you start doing that, you start to realize you know yourself better, you'll know your students better, and you can help to find the context in which they are optimally performing in. The
Yeah.
last one um, is this pathways principle, and I think this is really, really important. So, simply stated, it's this: for any outcome that you care about, there is always more than one equally valid pathway to get there. And this is one of those. So this comes from complex systems and systems dynamics, which it's one of the only laws we have in complex systems. It's called equifinality. That's the fancy word. That's all it means, right? Because if you think about it, any system that only had one pathway to get to an outcome would
Mhm.
be unbelievably fragile, right?
Yeah.
You sever any one part of that pathway and the whole system collapses. So that there's no way biology would ever give you a system with that, right? So and we don't have that. So why does this matter? Well, if you look at education right now, look at in the Netherlands at 12, right? We're all going to march through the same sequence at the
Yes.
same time, right?
Yes.
And at the same pace, and then we're going to make a decision. And you're going to go this way, or you're going to go this way, and there's no going back. It's not how it works. It's just not. Um, and
Yeah.
so it's so anyway. It would be one thing if we couldn't do more, but now we can create flexible pathways. We don't. It doesn't have to be more expensive, but we keep doing what we've done because it's the way we've done it, and that's just not good enough for our kids. It's not.
Yeah. Yeah. So we have three pathways. And by the way, you talked about the context pathway. We have we have big pharma who's really taking advantage of the context pathway in a negative way, because we 10% of kids in the Netherlands are diagnosed with ADHD. 10%. I mean, statistically, it should be 2%. I talked to some professors who know more about this than I do, 2%, but yet it's 10% because teachers observe a kid who's really active and really jumpy and really going in all directions, and they come to the conclusion this must be ADHD, and they call to the local GP and said, well, could you prescribe this kid some Ritalin, or, and it's really easily done in the Netherlands.
Yeah.
Really easy. It's such a big industry.
It's
I think we would be shocked the amount of money that's going on in the HDHD industry.
yeah.
So we don't do it for
And
aggressiveness, but for HDHD. It must be the
oh,
same.
absolutely, absolutely. And the thing is think about it. Like that diagnosis is coming from somebody else looking at this kid and going, you know what? They won't do what I want them to do.
Yeah,
That's
one
really what
person.
this comes down to. Yeah. And it's like without fail, kids that get that label of ADHD, it's like I can always find you another context where another teacher will be like, are you kidding me?
Yeah.
They're great, right? Like, and my favorite thing is like they are always like, oh, but when they're playing video games, they have no problem paying attention. Well, great, then it's not an attention disorder. Thank you, right? It means it's boring. It means like it like and my the thing that's frustrating to me is being opposite of bored is entertained. It's not. It's engaged,
Yeah.
right? And we think that like somehow we don't have an obligation to engage kids to make learning meaningful and purposeful. I mean, like it's just so instead we'll literally be like, well, something's wrong with you because you can't sit and do what I'm telling you to do, even though you have no clue why it matters.
Yeah.
And we will literally give you a drug that is
Yeah.
like has real side effects. It is not, I'm not saying no one should ever take it. I think there are cases where
Yeah.
that makes sense. I think that number is shockingly small compared to what we're doing. But here's how bad and down the rabbit hole we've gotten there. when we started thinking about this idea of ADHD, we assumed that Ritalin only worked on kids that had that profile. And so we started using the drug as a diagnostic tool. But it turns out about 25% of what you'd call their general population also responds the exact same way to Ritalin. It makes them more focused, it makes them calm down, it doesn't make them hyper. So because we've used it that way, we overdiagnose from almost the very beginning.
Yeah. And I talked to some neuroscientists, and they explained to me that the reason why they're focused is because the many pathways in the brains are blocked, especially the creativity pathway. So it blocks kids from exploring, from being creative.
Yeah,
And so they become really
yeah,
docile. And so in the end, it's really detrimental, I think, to their development.
yeah.
So
And by the way, so whenever I tell a parent if you're going to get that diagnosis, I want to see them show me they don't have attention capabilities when they are motivated. If that's true, then we have an attention problem, right? It's almost always motivation, and that's a
yeah,
different problem,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
And
So, but
so it's like you can either, yeah, go ahead.
and there is one underlying problem that's really one of the biggest problems, I think, in education, and I experienced it today. You know, there were two girls sitting in the back, and they were really chatterboxes. They were really chit-chatting all day long, and it was really difficult to concentrate. And I warned one of the girls like 6 times, and she was using a phone, and she was really had a big mouth. And then at the end, I said, after 6 times, you have to leave now. You go to the principal. You can't be in this class right now. And she didn't. She just said, "I'm not going." And the rest of the class was looking at me and said, "What are you going to do, Mr. Sprakel? How are you going to solve this problem?" And I called the principal, but he didn't answer. And I called a coordinator. He didn't answer. So I was like, okay, just stay in class. I'm not going to make it too difficult. And in the end, after class, we talked and said, what did I do wrong? I looked at myself and I said, what should I have done for you to get working? And then she explained to me, when I went to school, I encountered this problem, and I was in this fight before, and then this happened. And in the end, it was really clear that there was so much going on in the head of this little girl. And so it was really easy for me to dismiss it as a behavioral problem. But
Yeah,
talk to her, it's not. And I think the most difficult problem for me and for most teachers is to look at yourself. I think this is the biggest pandemic in education, that teachers are not able to look in the mirror. So when it
yeah,
doesn't work in class, they resort to Ritalin. And they
yeah,
say you should to go to special ed school. And I think if we are able and to look in the mirror and to look at our own behavior, that would solve so many problems. And I think this is one of the biggest pandemics in education today. We are not able to look in the mirror.
yeah. I mean, I think you're spot on. That's exactly right.
So the last part I would like to address, if you have time, how much time do you have left?
I've got about another 5 minutes. Sorry,
Five
I'd love to
minutes.
spend more time.
The last part is about how do we design a system that works for the individual.
So look, I think there's a handful of things. Number one, there will not be one right way, right? That would be like contrary to the whole thing, right?
Yeah.
So getting away from the idea of, you know, like I want more local control, right? Because like local communities are going to be more homogeneous than national communities. But here's the thing: there's a handful of things that you could look for if you want to know, is an environment doing a good job with my child's individuality. So we've touched on some of these, like flexible design. So listen, like if you're looking at the stuff that the kids learning and they're assuming the same reading level, they're assuming they don't need to. It's not necessary. That's a dead giveaway. They've just put them in a standardized situation, and it's not really going to be great for them. The other thing are these ideas of like I want to see mastery based learning. I want to see if they are using bell curve tests to decide this, you've got to know that is not measuring your kid at all, right? There's no reason to do it. We know how to do mastery assessments. We understand how to do that. Like we do it all the time. Like
Mhm.
there's no reason why there should be anything other than mastery assessments. And then the other thing that's a little harder, but I think it's really important, is a, a, a better focus on self-determination for kids. I don't mean letting kids do whatever they want, right? Kids need scaffolding and support, but it's shocking how little choice kids actually get, right? And we know from the research that even giving kids choice amongst two things they don't care about increases motivation. We have a thing, what economists call behavioral or procedural utility, which economists are terrible at naming things. People care about having control in their life, even kids do,
Yeah.
and people will consistently take worse outcomes if they get a say in their life. Adults do that, but so do kids, right? So finding ways to include them in meaningful choices in the things they do, um, is the fastest way to engagement and motivation. And I'm telling you, and I'm sure you know this from your expertise, kids who are motivated and engaged, a heck of a lot of problems go away in a hurry,
Sure.
right?
Sure. Yeah.
So these things aren't rocket science, and there's a lot of other stuff that people can do. But if I don't see flexible design, I don't see mastery learning, I don't see multiple pathways to things, and I don't see a focus on greater choice and self determination, then I'm saying we're still stuck in the old system. Um, but those are the things I would look for. And there's not one, again, not one right way. There are hundreds of ways that you can do this really well, but they all have these principles in common.
Yeah. And I think technology could add greatly to all these different pathways. We need technology in order to do that because a teacher can't differentiate on 60 different levels. That's virtually
For
impossible.
sure. And guess what? The pandemic has now made technology a
Yes.
fundamental part of education. So now it's up to us. How do we use it? Do we literally use it to do more of what we did, or do we use it to create more flexibility? Right. And that's our choice. We get to make that choice.
I always ask my interviewees at the end of the interview, who inspires you and who should I interview next?
So in education, the person that inspires me the most is someone named Diane Tavener. And she created a place called Summit Schools, which took all these ideas we're talking about and literally made it real. And it's just deeply impressive to be a part, to go to any one of those schools. And so I'm a sucker, like I'm an ideas person. I have the luxury of not having to worry like you do about real life, right? Like you get up every day and have to deal with a kid in the back of the class, and I get to deal in the world of hypothetical, right? I get it. My job's easier. So I'm always impressed with people who have to do it for real, right? And so when you see someone like just crushing it, and really both both and the reason I love it is having spent a lot of time in those schools and with those kids. And by the way, these are just public schools. These are public charter schools. They do not cherry pick. These are just like this. In fact, they oversample for kids that have struggled and kids that are in lower SES, socioeconomic status. The level of self-confidence that these kids have coming out of it is just unbelievable. It's what you wish your kids had, what you wish every kid had. And so I think talking to people like that who are on the front lines of transforming these kind of systems, I think that's worth it. And she inspires me like nobody else.
Diane Tavener, and you were in contact, and she used your specific ideas in order to design a charter school with.
She I would say in fairness to Diane, she designed stuff herself that happens to be very consistent with. I would be taking way too much credit for what she's done. I've learned as much from her as I'm sure she's ever learned from me. But there, there are some good ideas, and there are people doing amazing things. She deserves all the credit for that. I didn't. I wish I could take credit for it, but she's amazing.
Todd, you were really generous with your time. So I would like to thank you, and thank you for writing this book. I mean, it was really inspiring. It was really fun to read, and really, there's some hope at the end of the tunnel. Especially your penultimate chapter about education is really important for me. So I'm going to spread the word here in the Netherlands. about your book, about your work, about jaggedness, about the pathway principle, the context principle, and we are going to make it work. It has to happen.
There you go.
Todd.
Thank
It was a pleasure
Thank
talking
you.
to you. And
You too.
enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks. Take care.